Everyone, it's time for us to continue in our story hour. We're going to finish up our biography on Haskell this evening and start a new book after that. So I'm glad all of you have joined us. We've already had our prayer. So let's begin right away to finish our book on S.N. Haskell, Man of Action. The 1915 Autumn Council of the General Conference Committee was held at Loma Linda, California. During the session, Elder Daniels called a meeting of the constituency of the medical college to consider the interests of the school. Early instruction received through the Lord's special messenger to the church stated that many young people were to be trained at Loma Linda as medical missionaries. On one occasion, she declared, quote, "Physicians will be trained here," end quote. Those who came for instruction were to receive superior training in treating all manner of diseases, both physical and spiritual. Later, in response to an inquiry, Mrs. White made clear that the school should be prepared to graduate physicians who could pass examinations required by law to enable them to practice as fully qualified physicians. In harmony with these objectives, a charter was obtained in 1909 for the College of Medical Evangelists. Those close to the new school soon saw that if the spirit of prophecy counsels calling for full medical course to be given in our own new college were to be followed, we must make adequate provision for a strong clinical work that would bring the students into close contact with many people suffering from all types of diseases, the diseases they would meet in actual practice. The answer to this seemed to be a clinical hospital in the city of Los Angeles. But this would be costly. Many thousands of dollars had already been invested in the school. All instructional requirements had been provided except those in the clinical department. Now, many more thousands were needed for the hospital building, and this at a time when financial resources of the General Conference were heavily taxed to support new missionary endeavors in many parts of the world. The men sitting in council that day were serious. Where could the money be obtained to erect and equip a hospital building? If we call on our people for large amounts of money that are required, will it not discourage them? If sufficient appropriations are budgeted by the General Conference, will it not retard our missionary program? Some committee members argued in favor of moving forward without delay at God's bidding, trusting Him to remove these seemingly insurmountable obstructions. Others spoke against becoming further involved until more money was available. We must adhere to the no debt ruling of the General Conference, they said. We must raise the money before we spend it. Mrs. White herself had heartily endorsed that plan. It was obvious that delay would mean great loss and might result eventually in the complete failure of the school. A sense of the importance of the decision that must be made rested heavily upon every committee member. Strong convictions were expressed on both sides. Further attempts to arrive at a definite decision seemed useless. In this hour of perplexity, when it appeared that an impasse had been reached, a gentle tap was heard on the door, and I know we read this last time. This is like a review. It was opened, and there stood 4 Adventist sisters. They were Mrs. Haskell, her widowed sister, Mrs. Emma Gray, a self-reliant woman who for 4 years had managed the home farm and supported her children. Dr. Florence Keller recently returned from mission service in New Zealand, and Mrs. Josephine Gotzian, widow of a wealthy shoe manufacturer and a liberal contributor to Seventh-day Adventist missions. Courteously, they requested admittance and a moment of the committee's time. The women then earnestly presented their plea for the advancement of the medical school and for the erection of the proposed hospital building in Los Angeles as a teaching unit in the clinical division. They further requested that the task of raising the money for erecting and equipping the hospital, estimated at more than $60,000, be committed to the women of the denomination. For a moment there was silence. A hush pervaded the room. All felt the presence of God in their midst. Then, without further plea or argument, the 4 women thanked the committee members for listening and withdrew. This voluntary offer of assistance, so perfectly timed, strengthened the faith of many and inspired fresh courage in all. Elder Daniels, with a few men of strong faith, spent the early part of the night reviewing the instructions Mrs. White had given regarding the school and praying for further guidance. The following morning, in an address to the conference committee, Elder Daniels declared his conviction that there was only one way to go, and that was forward. Even while admitting fears and apprehensions which he knew were shared by others, he unhesitatingly declared, "We do not say stop, we say go on and maintain this school and make it a success." The voluntary proposal of the 4 women and the act of faith expressed by Daniels, Haskell, Irwin, Evans, Burden, and others gave courage to all, and a motion was carried favoring the expansion of the school. The conference committee promptly moved into action and authorized the 4 women to lead the women of the denomination in a campaign to raise the required $61,000. A nationwide drive was inaugurated and placed under the leadership of Mrs. Haskell and Mrs. G.A. Irwin. An article by I.H. Evans in the Review of January 13, 1916, explained the need and announced Mrs. Haskell as chairman of the Women's Committee, commissioned to direct the fundraising campaign. The state conferences were advised to appoint auxiliary secretaries to take charge of the funds, and Mrs. Haskell was commissioned to correspond with these secretaries. While awaiting news of their appointment, she went to work at once, writing to everyone she could think of, arousing interest in the forthcoming campaign. In the review, she addressed the women of the denomination, telling them of their opportunity to raise money to build and equip the Ellen G. White Memorial Hospital, comparing them to all the women that were wise-hearted, who did spin with their hands to provide hangings for the ancient tabernacle. She urged them to do all in their power to furnish the equipment for the medical school. Articles by leading ministers and by Dr. McGann appeared frequently in the Review and in conference papers, setting forth the imperative need of a hospital. Leaflets were broadcast. The churches were stirred into action. Energetic women were chosen as leaders to encourage everyone to help. Goals were set, and various methods devised for raising money. Gifts of books from authors and publishers mounted into the scores of thousands. Ellen G. White's The Ministry of Healing, Haskell's Story of Daniel, and Seer of Patmos, A.W. Spalding's Men of the Mountains, all were sold by enthusiastic promoters of medical missions who turned their profits into the building fund. An elderly sister came up with an original idea. During the Loma Linda Council, she had counted several veterans on the grounds, all of them in their 70s and 80s, and 5 of them past 80. J. N. Loughborough, G. I. Butler, S. N. Haskell, H. W. Decker, and J. H. Rogers. She assembled them and had photographs taken. The prints sold at 50 cents apiece. Thus these worthies, poor in worldly treasure, were enabled to make a substantial contribution to the hospital fund. As the Haskells visited camp meetings, institutes, and churches, they appealed for contributions to the hospital fund. In California alone, they held meetings in 25 churches and then journeyed on to the other states. All pledges and cash receipts received by them were forwarded to the auxiliary secretaries of the various state conferences. $61,000, however, was but the beginning. Dormitories, classrooms, and many other buildings would be needed. Dr. McGann, recently called to the medical college as dean, entered the campaign with his burning interest in the training of medical missionaries and his gift of oratorical persuasion. He was able to swell the building fund. October 14, 1916, was appointed in all the churches for a Loma Linda offering, with the suggestion that it be made $1 day. 2 months later, the foundation of the Los Angeles division of the hospital was laid. Mrs. Lida Scott, a year before, had contributed $5,000 toward the purchase of land for a building site. The location in Boyle Heights was ideal. As McGann noted, within 10 minutes walking distance from the hospital was a great foreign field in which were thousands of poor people who needed both medical aid and the gospel. Among these multitudes, prospective doctors and nurses would find every variety of ailment and gain experience that would equip them for service in almost any part of the world. After 2 years, the Los Angeles Hospital complex was complete. Elder and Mrs. Haskell were privileged to attend the dedicatory services held at 3 o'clock on Sunday, April 21, 1918. On that day, marking the opening of the White Memorial Hospital, songs of thanksgiving ascended from many joyful hearts. But it is doubtful that any experienced deeper satisfaction than Stephen and Hetty Haskell at being privileged to be there and share in this, their last major project, the launching of a medical missionary program that would have a worldwide influence. Throughout his busy life, the elder enjoyed social occasions, although he seldom took time to participate in them. He could recall only 4 or 5 birthday celebrations. One especially stood out in his memory. He had been enjoying a quiet evening in his library at the old South Lancaster home when he suddenly noticed that the house was rapidly filling with students. Then he remembered it was April 22, 1913. He must be 80 years old that day. The instigator and manager of the surprise party had been Milton Hare, the same person who, as a boy of 15, had hauled many loads of bricks for lining the cistern at Avondale School. Now he was a member of the South Lancaster faculty. There were speeches, gifts, and refreshments. Elder Haskell had been moved nearly to tears by some of the expressions of loving remembrance showered upon him that evening. It is reported that a few salty tears did escape when he saw a red, large, plush armchair handed in through a window and learned that it was a birthday gift from his devoted wife Hetty, author of Stephen Haskell's special joys had been the horses he had owned. Back in 1902, Hetty had written to Sister White describing one of his favorites. He still remembered how he had enjoyed getting away from New York City to his home in South Lancaster, then hurrying to rattle the barn door to hear the horse whinny. Mrs. Haskell's letter read, quote, "You know how fond Elder Haskell is of a horse, and he has secured one that he thinks is a jewel. And it is a very pretty horse, a dark bay, not quite to my liking because he scares at the trains sometimes and likes to dance a little bit. But you know, he would never enjoy riding behind a horse that didn't dance once in a while. The horse is very intelligent, kind, and gentle, and we only had it a day or two until it would whinny every time the barn door rattled." Elder Haskell had made a pet of it so quickly that it knew his step before the first week was out. He takes great delight in driving past the electric cars with the horse to show how much more gentle it is becoming, and I think that in time it will not scare very much. Not that I'm afraid of it at all now, only if I did not make a little fuss about his driving scary horses, he would be breaking colts half the time, and I think he's too old for that kind of work. He does love a horse that has a good deal of fire in it. At 69, he would have enjoyed breaking wild colts. Now he was 85, and 1902 was a long time ago. As the years passed rapidly, Elder Haskell grieved because he felt that he was accomplishing so little. He could do so many things if his strength were only greater. His wife tried to comfort him. She said, "Stephen, when you were young, you were out and preached your sermons. Now you write them and people distribute them all over the world. Whereas in your younger days, you were reaching hundreds. Now in your old age, your books are reaching thousands, accomplishing 1,000-fold more than when you were younger." And the patriarch was comforted. He could not know that he and Hetty had only a brief period remaining when they could travel together among their beloved church groups, visiting camp meetings and schools. Then in 1919, a severe illness laid Hetty low. After some weeks in the New England sanitarium, she died on October 21, 1919. Since that long ago day at Lemoore, California, when Hetty, a young teacher, had stood trembling, grasping the back of the chair in front of her to make a declaration for Christ in the words, "Brethren and sisters, God wants me." And she had never swerved in her allegiance to him. That same day she had walked up to one of the ministers, holding something out to him in her two cupped hands. She had said, "Hold fast all I give you." and she had slipped into his hands a gold watch chain, rings, breast pins, and other prized pieces of jewelry. This act symbolized her complete dedication of life to the Master's service. The next May, at the end of the school year, she began her 34 years of Christian work. For the second time, Haskell was alone. Mary had died long years ago and had been laid to rest in California in a cemetery in Napa. Then God had sent Hetty. For 22 years, she and Stephen had traveled and worked together. Now she lay on the eastern side of the continent near the old South Lancaster home he and Mary had shared so many years before. Elder Haskell was 86 years old. He could have retired, but a long and busy life had not equipped him to change lifelong habits. In 1919, only 3 years before his death, he made another contribution to the denomination in the form of a vest pocket reference book, Bible Handbook, listing important Bible texts paralleled by appropriate quotations from the Spirit of Prophecy writings. It contained 182 pages of references grouped as Bible study outlines under more than 200 topical headings. Until his strength failed and the shadows lengthened, he continued attending institutes and camp meetings in different states and was actively engaged in the general work. At the 1922 General Conference in San Francisco, Stephen Haskell, along with other pioneers, received special honor. Soon after that meeting, because of increasing weakness, he was obliged to enter the Paradise Valley Sanitarium near San Diego, California. Since to him life and work were synonymous, the one could not long exist without the other. On October 9, 1922, Elder S.N. Haskell died in his 90th year. At one time, when asked, "Would you choose to be buried next to Mary in California or by Hetty in the East?" he replied, "Just place me beside the one I am closest to when I die, or I'm nearest to when I die." His grave is next to Mary's in Tulaque Cemetery at Napa, California. Under the title, A Long Life Spent for God, W.A. Spicer, president of the General Conference, wrote in the Review and Herald, quote, "Day after day, at the recent General Conference, Elder S.N. Haskell sat with the group of pioneer workers on the platform. We felt that this veteran of many a conference session and of many a journey in pioneering service was being sustained in his regular attendance more by his unabated spiritual vigor and the habit of a lifetime of devotion than by his physical forces. And now, nearing his 90th milestone, Elder Haskell's life of service is ended, and he awaits the sure triumph of the message and the movement that he loved. Elder Haskell was a pioneer in missionary promotion at home and abroad, and he found this truth on the road as a salesman, and until age crept over him, he was ever on the road, carrying the treasure of truth to others. It seems inadequate to try to sum up nearly 70 years of service in a short article. His message of faith and trust in God and in the triumph of the work of God will live with us until the end. F.N. Wilcox, editor of the Review and Herald, followed Elder Spicer in tribute. Brother Haskell was a man loved by all within the circle of his acquaintance, and this circle was by no means a small one. In reality, it compassed the whole earth because Brother Haskell was known for his work's sake, not alone in North America, but in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australasia. South Africa is the only great division of our work which he never visited. He was a self-made man in the truest sense of that word, born of poor parentage, with limited school advantages. He heard in early manhood the call of God to a greater work, the work of the gospel ministry. Especially did he give himself to the study of the Word. His knowledge of the Bible was extensive and unique. His preaching abounded with practical illustrations and precious principles drawn from its sacred pages. He was mightily used of God through the years in the upbuilding of his work on this earth, rising step by step through perseverance and application until he occupied some of the most responsible positions in the work of the denomination. What he accomplished in his life through the blessing of God, other young men similarly situated can accomplish with the same spirit of zeal and determination. The influence of his godly life will roll on until the work is done. And that concludes our biography of S.N. Haskell. And it's been an inspiring biography to me, and I hope to you also.